just to give you a basic idea of what a mark is going to look like once it's been drawn on the screen and then printed on the paper. Again, you can see that you capture, pretty true detail. This is watercolor that had been mixed with soap, like dish soap, that was kind of stirred into a bubbly froth and then just kind of puddled onto the surface of the screen. And then as it dried, it kind of left this crackly texture that you see here in these spaces. And watercolor often, if you puddle it on the screen, likes to create these, as you know, if you've used watercolor, these kind of nice, dark, crisp edges. So this is an image of string that was dipped in a watercolor solution, a pretty, saturated watercolor, so that the string, which was, kind of fibrous, absorbed the watercolor. Then once, that mess came out of the watercolor solution, it was laid onto the screen very carefully, kind of pressed down a little bit and allowed to dry. And once it dried, it was then peeled up off of the screen only then. Here's another example of the same process, but with a cheesecloth, like a piece of cloth, a cheesecloth, which is quite open in terms of the fibers. These were rubber bands dipped in watercolor and laid on the screen and left to dry. So, kind of nice variable marks, but with a very simple material that you would not necessarily consider an art material. So these were, and this is the last one of these were washers, like metal washers that were dipped in the watercolor, liquid watercolor solution, and then laid on the screen and allowed to dry. And then once they were dry, they were peeled off. And these images, which I'm going to show you, are mostly watercolor. The difference being that this shape that you see in the center was actually created by putting an adhesive stencil on the surface of the screen, like a sticker, basically sticking this onto the screen. So that stencil was made with contact paper, which you might know of as more of like a shelf lining material, really cheap. You can get it at the hardware store. I like the clear stuff so I can see what's happening, but any will work. Now, what happens with the contact paper that I find interesting is the way that it kind of seeps in under the edges of the shape. It's kind of, you've got all this wet liquid on the screen. It just kind of gets under there, but it makes these really interesting kinds of edges. If you don't like that, then you might want to consider actually exposing or drawing a solid stencil onto the screen with screen filler or using the photomechanical stencils. And then we made a ghost of it. So you can see that we did transfer quite a bit of the information from the first image onto the first piece of paper. So there wasn't a lot, but where there was a lot, surprisingly, was in the edges of the contact paper stencil. Because this is another image similar to this one with the washers. So the difference between these two, in this one the washers were actually dipped in watercolor and then applied to the screen to let dry, whereas this, the washers were clean, there was nothing on them, they were dry, they were perfect, they were set on the screen, and then watercolor was sort of poured and painted in between the negative areas of the washers and allowed to, dry. Then the washers were removed. And because the washers are just sitting there, information, watercolor is going to get underneath those physical objects and create these nice textural marks. I do have a couple of images that have already been created that we can kind of talk about first. This image, now I have exposed an image onto the screen photomechanically. So what I've done here is I've simply created watercolor washes the way you would normally, and I've applied them, but I've used this contact paper shape of the cow first. So that was cut out of my contact paper. Basically, when I'm ready to print this image, I will actually peel him off. But this is the result. So you can kind of see the sharp edges of the contact paper, but all of this light watercolor was stuff that had seeped in from underneath. It was just really pale. What's interesting, and I didn't consider this when I made it, was this contact paper has a bit of a pattern on it, and that actually transferred into that area, which I didn't expect, but sort of a happy accident that I'm going to work with. After everything was dry, I simply used one of those art crayons, those big thick lipstick things, and I made that mark. You can apply materials to either side of the screen, the back or the front, but depending on the technique that you're using and the materials that you're using, sometimes it's going to be more beneficial to apply it to the front side of the screen, which is this concave side of the screen. Sometimes it's going to be better to apply it to the back side. When I'm using watercolors, it depends. The thicker the material, if you have really thick material, you're going to want to apply that to the back side. And the reason for that is if you're thinking about the fact that information. So the difference between these two, in this one, the washers were actually dipped in watercolor and then applied to the screen to let dry, whereas this, the washers were clean, there was nothing on them, they were dry, they were perfect, they were set on the screen, and then watercolor was sort of poured and painted in between the negative areas of the washers and allowed to, dry. Then the washers were removed. And because the washers are just sitting there, information, watercolor is going to get underneath those physical objects and create these nice textural marks. So this image is sort of a negative application. This image was sort of a positive application, if you want to think about it like that. And then, of course, ghost images were taken because you can't make screen print without taking a few ghosts. And what's nice about this is you can see that because the watercolor was so thick around those edges, it continues to print. There continues to be residual information in the screen, but the sort of mid-tones and lighter tones got used up a lot in that first image. And then we continued. Or actually, this is a ghost of that one. But then it starts to get a little wonky. So these are some of the things you're going to be seeing here. I do have a couple of images that have already been created that we can kind of talk about first. This image, now I have exposed an image onto the screen photomechanically. So everything that you see that's green is actually a light sensitive emulsion that was applied to the screen, and then an image was actually burned into the screen. So the image was just a flat square with rounded edges, very simple. And then I also used that cow from before, because it's a thick piece of paper and it will block light, I used that to also expose onto the screen. What I've done here is I've simply created watercolor washes the way you would normally, and I've applied them, but I've used this contact paper shape of the cow first. So that was cut out of my contact paper, I've got the paper backing here of him. So he was peeled off, applied to the screen, burnished down really, really well with my fingers, but you're never going to prevent liquid from getting underneath. So basically, when I'm ready to print this image, I will actually peel him off. So let's peel him off, because that's the fun part. And you'll see what you get and how much accuracy of those edges you can retain. Now, you may or may not be able to use this stencil again. It's going to lose stickiness each time. So I'm going to assume I'm not using it again, but at the same time, I want to try to get it off in one piece. Contact paper is great because it always comes back off. There we go. So this is still pretty sticky. I could probably use him again. Maybe I'll set him aside. He's kind of nice, actually. I like him. But this is the result. So you can kind of see the sharp edges of the contact paper, but all of this light watercolor was stuff that had seeped in from underneath. It was just really pale. What's interesting, and I didn't consider this when I made it, was this contact paper has a bit of a pattern on it, and that actually transferred into that area, which I didn't expect, but sort of a happy accident that I'm going to work with. After everything was dry, I simply used one of those art crayons, those big thick lipstick things, and I made that mark. And I drizzled a little bit of powder. So let's set this aside, and we'll talk a little bit about applying it to the screen. Now, you can apply materials to either side of the screen, the back or the front, but depending on the technique that you're using and the materials that you're using, sometimes it's going to be more beneficial to apply it to the front side of the screen, which is this concave side of the screen. Sometimes it's going to be better to apply it to the back side. If I'm applying really heavy materials, heavy layers of watercolor, heavy layers of charcoal, or anything on the thick side, I want to apply those to the back side or underside because it's going to be easier to bond that information that's on the screen, that drawing, to the paper if it doesn't have to go through the mesh first, if it's kind of sitting on the underside. But if you have really thin materials like watercolor washes and things that aren't drawn really heavily, it's easy enough to get them through the mesh of the screen. So it's just something to think about. If I'm using watercolor, sometimes I do the front, sometimes I do the back. I often do the back. And the reason I do the back is because I can flip the screen over, right? So now the mesh is automatically, an inch from the surface of the table. So there's no direct contact between the mesh and the table. So it gives me that automatic kind of propping up. But if I prefer my materials to be on the front, then I would simply have something under my screen, and you want to think about the layering of information. Think about the way you would make a painting. You kind of have a background, and then a middle ground, and then a foreground. You want to work the same way, but it changes if you're working on the front side of the screen versus the back side. If I'm working on the front, I would work kind of normally. I'd put my background down first, then my midground, then, my foreground in that direction because I'm going to be pushing it all through the screen. It's going to be represented in exactly the same way. But if I'm doing it this way, on the back side of the screen, whatever I draw first is the foreground. So I'm almost working in reverse, foreground to midground to background. What you are going to want is something underneath your screen to catch the dripping. So you can see here I've got some scrap paper. You'll want, your basic watercolor material. So I've got a handful of brushes. I've got some water. I've got a few, whatever you mix your watercolor in. Let's say I want to make a big wash kind of area in the background. I'm going to have a fair amount of information. So here in my blue container, I don't actually have a lot of material. So I'm just going to add a little bit of watercolor. I'm going to use a larger, wider brush to mix that up. Once I've got it really thoroughly mixed up, I'm going to come back to my screen. And you generally want to kind of keep that container not over the image, but to the side. And, I'm going to apply it. And so you'll see it kind of stands on the surface of the screen versus if you're working on paper, it is absorbed down into the paper. It doesn't just sit there. So it is different than working on paper. I continue to sort of fiddle with it. I can mix other colors in there to give it some depth and complexity instead of all being one single color. But things that happen that are kind of interesting is that if you put it on really thick, meaning with a lot of water, the water is heavy, often you'll see, do you see these little round marks where the watercolor kind of comes together and then it starts to drip underneath? These will actually dry that way. If you are drawing on the thinner side, you won't get that. And it's just going to take longer to dry if you put a big puddle down than if you just do a thinner mark. So that might be something that you want to think about. Do I want to leave this overnight? Because this might take hours to dry. This might take 15 minutes, but this might take 5 hours. Again, you can use blow dryers or other things to speed up the process, but it will take time if you're working this way. If I add wet into wet, it's going to start to bleed out and maybe do some hideous things or maybe some really wonderful things. Only time will tell, right? As gravity and physics kind of take over, you can use all of the tools that you might normally use with water to create texture. You can put it on a toothbrush and use it to create like grainy little textures. You could dip things into it to create other textures like, saran wrap or paper towels if you want to blot up areas. I mean, there's all kinds of things you can do. So let's show you some images that we're going to be printing. I'm going to carefully set this aside. So I would want to keep it obviously level. The other image that I created that we'll be printing, but this image is all watercolor, except this shape, as you can see here, is this piece of cheesecloth. So you can kind of see how that. So basically, I mixed up a large portion of watercolor in here. I took the cheesecloth and I just dipped it in and moved it around until it had fully saturated and absorbed the watercolor. And then it was all like wet and weird, and I applied it, so it doesn't matter. But I gently laid it on the screen. Now, the watercolor that's kind of brownish red was on there and it was still wet. So this, was set into that wet watercolor, and I like lightly pressed it down, and then I let it dry. So once it was dry, I came back and I peeled it off, and then you can see what I've gotten. Then these areas were simply, again, wet watercolor was already down. I took these, these pieces of metal and I placed them on the screen. And then I came in with my watercolor, and I kind of made marks around them, brought in this blue color and kind of just played with it and built up some watercolor around the pieces of metal. Then they were allowed to fully dry, and then they were peeled carefully off. They did stick quite a bit, so you don't want to damage the screen, but again, you get these kind of nice edges that you can only get this way. Then the last thing that I did was I drew on top of all of this with, I believe this was one of the watercolor Stabilo pencils. It was this guy. So because I have, this transparency in the screen, even after my watercolor and everything were on the screen, I would still be able to stick this image underneath to use as a guide. And I just laid that underneath so you can see how, it's a little difficult, but not too difficult to see. And I was able to kind of trace that with the Stabilo on top of everything else. The rules are very different than maybe edition printmaking, where everything is much more systematic and planned out. So yeah, you want to have fun.